Alrighty. Looks like we got some folks trickling in here. My name is Ethan Muntz. I am a strategic threat analyst here at Health-ISAC, and today it is my pleasure to introduce Breakpoint Labs to give a webinar about lessons from a real-world hospital penetration tester. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Andrew McNicol, and take it away, Andrew.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, so today what I'm going to do is sort of try to transfer lessons learned from my career of sort of hacking hospitals for the last going on 16 plus years. I've done a lot of environments, but ended up doing a lot of hospitals over that time, and I see a lot of repeated trends for some of the security deficiencies and a lot of lessons learned. And what I wanted to do is sort of give back to the community and share that information that's actionable, so you can go back and drive security in your environments. This is a little bit quick agenda. We're going to go over sort of who am I, who's Breakpoint Labs. Go over how to conduct a comprehensive security assessment in life supporting systems. There's a lot of different planning things that should go into place to make sure you're doing it safely, and then sort of focus in on those critical security gaps that I see on every engagement. And we will talk about a little bit about AI and sort of what new threats and risks that's bringing to the playing field here, and then land off on some of the key lessons and actual recommendations that we put together with HHS as part of a lot of the work that we've done. So as I said, I'm Andrew McNicol. I've been doing this for a while. Breakpoint Labs has been in business for about 10 years. Prior to that, I was still doing penetration testing, and I also worked with law enforcement and counterintelligence, doing incident response and malware analysis. And I got to study the bad guys a lot there, kind of chasing with law enforcement. And then what I've done is taken that experience and brought it over to more of a proactive approach to security by helping to emulate that activity in a safe manner to help places secure their environments before the bad guys come in and cause an incident and cause a problem. So that's kind of my passion, what I really enjoy doing. And what drives me at work is really just finding high impact, critical risk vulnerabilities that have been missed for 10 plus years, right? Stuff that doesn't show up in a vulnerability scanner, but would be something that an attacker would abuse. And there's a huge deviation there. A lot of people feel like they run their vuln scanner, they have their risk in front of them, and they're kind of trying to tackle that. And that's already kind of a insurmountable problem as it is, right? You can't. Everybody knows you can't remediate everything in that report. Well, generally, the way that I take over in hospitals and same with bad guys, stuff that we're doing isn't even in that report. So it's kind of a interesting shift in mindset, and hopefully you'll see some of those examples here. I will be walking through real world examples that I've done, both from cyber and physical. So hopefully you'll find it interesting. I'll try to tell the story as we go. We're going to be walking through a penetration test. The first few slides, you're going to be talking about planning and how to set it up properly. And I do that because it is very different than how you conduct a penetration test in a traditional enterprise environment, significantly different. So we're going to talk about some of those differences and how do you approach them during the planning phase. So I'm sure everybody here knows, but you don't just start hacking, right? So you have to figure out how to do this safely. In most healthcare environments, this is kind of what I see the average size. I say that because we're going to talk about timeline a little bit, and it puts that in context. Generally speaking, 50 to 100 applications, 80 to 100 internet connected systems, and about 1,000 IP addresses. Now that's maybe like more of a middle tier size. I've done engagements that span the United States, right? The network that's across the United States. So they certainly can scale. So your environment is very likely different, but generally speaking, this is kind of how we're framing this planning here. We talk about the timeline. Usually the pre-engagement phase, that planning phase, is about 1 week to 1 month. That's really dependent upon how quickly the meetings take place, coordinating people's schedules. There's a lot of important people that generally need to be involved that might add some delays. So it's generally, you don't rush this part. You take it slow. You figure out how to set things up. The first thing you want to have in mind and set up is a clear established goals and objectives. What are you trying to get out of this engagement? This could be adherence to a compliance standard. Generally speaking, what I hope a goal is have a realistic picture of how a threat actor sees my environment. Where's the risk that I need to be aware of, remediate or monitor, and at least acknowledge, accept, understand, right? Because a lot of that stuff, you don't want to find out you had a huge risk in an incident, right? That's the worst time to find out. So that should be one of the main goals, but there may be others. And we'll discuss that a little bit. The second area is discussing detection avoidance. This is very important to discuss ahead of time because it's a common assumption made on either side, right? Either the hospital has an assumption, the testing company has an assumption. Penetration tests, by their nature, are not designed to be stealthy. They're designed to be efficient and find the maximum number of vulnerabilities. When you talk about being a stealthy mission to avoid detection, that usually falls into what's called a red team. But you can be stealthy during a penetration test if that's one of your goals, right? So you want to make sure you discuss that, because I have seen this happen all too many times on an engagement. You do the engagement and you get some stakeholders involved that are like lower level IT folks, and they're like, well, we detected you. So like that's not real risk because we detected you. Well, was that even part of the planning? Probably, if it wasn't, then I would have done the engagement entirely differently, right? So the way you go about the test, if detection is a goal, is very, very different, night and day difference, right? So it's important to understand that, and you can blend both worlds. So what we usually do is, because the pro of avoiding of not worrying about detection is efficiency. You can go through things more efficiently, and it lowers the price. When you add in detection avoidance, you have to go through things a lot slower, and it raises the level of effort associated with the price. So the way that we do it generally is sort of a hybrid approach, right? We go through the engagement like normal, we finish it, and at the end, the last few days, we'll go through and emulate stealthy attacker techniques and map it back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework with timestamps, and then work with you to see which one of those you detected and where you didn't. So you still get the benefit of that detection avoidance, but you don't have to pay the full amount of, like, say, if you're doing a red team, which, by the way, if you haven't done a penetration test before, doing a red team is going to add limited value. You're better off getting a pen test first, doing a bunch of remediation, and then doing a full-blown, red team engagement. But in general, that hybrid approach I find works really well for hospitals. And that's usually what we do, is allocate some time at the end to sort of do a purple team style engagement where we're doing that stealthy activity and then testing your controls. But we're not relying on that stealth when we find the vulnerabilities per se. You want to define the scope, which is essentially what's going to be tested and how that testing is going to occur. So you might say, is this just an external penetration test, or is it also internal? Is wireless in scope? Is physical in scope? These are all things to sort of hammer out to figure out, what we're putting in scope for the engagement based on the goals and objectives. Discussing an assumed breach scenario. This is another area where you see a lot of assumptions made, right? So if you think somebody's going to hack me, you'll think, well, come in from the internet, break in through an application, right? Or phish, right? Land on somebody's box, do it as real like the bad guy as possible. There's benefits to that, and there's risks, right? So when you force a team to come in through an application or impact a user potentially by coming in through phishing or things like that, you are adding additional risk to the project. What we find the best approach for hospitals is to do a assumed breach scenario, where you still test for all these ways that you could get into the network, and you still identify that risk, but you don't require the testing team to push through those areas to test inside. So that assumed breach scenario is essentially saying, okay, we're going to assume a breach happened. We're going to establish internal testing infrastructure for the testing team. This removes that risk, from having to come in through an operational application or coming in through a user that you have to compromise. All that stuff, adds risk. And when you talk about a life-supporting environment, you usually want to reduce risk as much as possible. So the assumed breach scenario is really good. Helps you get the benefit of still understanding how somebody would break in, but you're not relying on the team to push through those holes, and you're able to test and find that internal risk as still. And then establish the key stakeholders. So who should be defined in this in driving the goals and objectives. And this is the last planning slide, I think, directly planning. So we'll talk about some of these last few components, and then we'll get into some more interesting stuff that's a little more focused on technical aspects. So what we like to figure out is understanding what are your fears? What are some key fears that keep you up at night? That's going to drive and help really maximize the return on investment for you on the engagement. So are you fear about the backup and disaster recovery plan and solution you have in place? You can design test cases around that in the actual pen test so that you can sort of flush that out and see how that fear comes to reality. So it's important to understand fears. A common fear, ransomware, right? So you can understand, like, if ransomware got in the network, how could it propagate? We can actually test that and make that a use case and make that a finding in the report, right? Ransomware resiliency, and discuss sort of some of your controls around that so you can better defend against it. So that it allows us to sort of really understand what you're worried about and take a look at it during the engagement. You also want to discuss these critical systems that are on their network. If you're a hospital, you've got critical systems, so you want to approach those differently, and you can discuss that with the folks doing the penetration test. I don't suggest completely ignoring them, but you may go about it very differently. You can discuss potentially cloning them into development environments, or doing just sort of a white glove review alongside the sysadmin for that system, right? But you still could look at it. You just may address it very differently. Determine your testing time frames and timeline. Understand maybe you have to test after hours or just during business hours or 24/7, right? So you want to figure all that out. Define your communication plan. That's also very important. So you want to understand what's the cadence of communication. Usually it's a weekly thing, right? Usually what we do is we have a weekly sync, a weekly touch point. On Friday is usually a good day. People's schedules are a little slower usually, but that's all individual to you. I've had some customers that want to do a daily touch point in the morning, and even before we ended the day, we touch point, right? So it all depends on what works best for your environment. And then just establish your trusted points of contact for deconfliction. When you have an engagement going on, you might notice, oh, somebody's calling in because this application is running slow, and you're immediately going to want to, well, if the guy's doing the pen test, and maybe it is, maybe it's not, but you want to make sure you have your trusted points of contact that you reach out to, so they can say, oh, we're not even looking at that, it's not us, or that is us, we'll stop testing, kind of thing. So you have that deconfliction process on both sides. It's important for the testing team as well, because if they find something critical, especially on an internet-facing asset, they're going to want to reach out to you immediately and maybe start remediation before the test is done, right? Because it's on the internet, a threat actor could see it, and you want to kind of address that maybe sooner than in a couple of weeks. Discuss your approved testing infrastructure. And then all this gets put into a sort of a master document called the Rules of Engagement document. This is going to codify everything about the test, how it's going to be performed, the scope, what's allowed, what's not allowed. So everything kind of scopes and frames the entire assessment in that Rules of Engagement document. And everybody agrees on that, signs off on it, the stakeholders. So everybody's on the same page. We try to remove all those assumptions that are maybe baked in, so everybody's on the same page. And this is another slide I put in here for lessons learned perspective, right? So a lot of times when you talk about a penetration test, it's pretty standard to say like 1 week, do a pen test in a week. And that's not the right approach for hospitals, because you guys do have life supporting systems. And if you try to push everything into a week, well, you're going to really increase your risk of negative system impact or just miss a lot of stuff. So our suggested approach working with hospitals is to have it a little more drawn out. Now, it doesn't mean you're billing for full-time out efforts that 4 to 6 weeks. It's not going to map to that much of an increase, but it allows things to happen slower, more methodical. And that's important because when you go against life-supporting technology, you don't want to, overload it and cause an impact. You want to be nice and slow. And a lot of the stuff we do in medical environments is manual. So we're not launching a tool at it. We're going at it manually, because launching a tool at it could cause negative impact. Usually the report takes about a week or 2 to complete, and then you schedule your out briefs. We usually suggest 2 different levels, a technical deep dive, and then that higher level management stuff focused on, maybe the remediation roadmap and sort of, giving a good understanding of management where their risk is and how they can improve it. So now we're shifting gears to a little more technical stuff. This is a diagram that shows how we suggest conducting penetration tests. It really mirrors what the bad guy does. This is important because it allows you to fully flush out your defenses. So when we conduct a penetration test, we are leveraging infrastructure the same way someone remote that's a real bad guy is going to do it. They're going to leverage malware, which in this instance is just software that allows remote control over a system, right? So malware gets a bad name, right? It's saying, hasn't like ransomware or something, right? In this instance, it's just remote control software. It's installed on the testing infrastructure and it communicates back out to our controlled infrastructure via like HTTPS. And that's important because that's the way a real threat actor is interacting with your environment on the inside. Once they establish that internal access, they're leveraging what's called command and control, C2, you probably heard that term, to communicate back to a management server where they control the endpoint. And we leverage that same sort of infrastructure setup so that you can understand sort of where your controls are completely. So you'll actually see, like, we can see, hey, did you detect our command and control? And we'll do several different types of commonly used C2 to see if you're detecting it at your network level or not. So it's important to sort of go about this as realistic as possible so you can truly see, where the risk is. And getting initial access. So we're going to talk about this a little bit. What I find is folks think phishing is probably your biggest area of getting internet access, right? You phish a user, you compromise them. And while that's still true, that is something that still happens. I actually get in a lot of different ways. It's generally not phishing. I usually we'll do phishing, but there's easier ways to get in than phishing. Phishing has gotten a lot harder, especially in the context of a month-long engagement. A lot of the phishing controls are very intelligent, and they look for infrastructure that has been aged, years on the internet, and they won't trust it if it's newly registered domain or newly stood up stuff. And that's difficult to do on an engagement. So phishing is, certainly still a risk, but there's a lot of things that I get into that don't even involve phishing we're going to talk about. One of the bigger risks is, generally speaking, when I go to a hospital, they don't know what they have on the internet. That is absolutely the case. I've seen printers on the internet. I've seen multitude of technologies. I've seen medical IoT devices on the internet, from a medical app that was used for messaging doctors and nurses on the internet, right? So like things like that, they didn't know. So it's really important to understand what's on the internet. That's the first challenge. And understanding that, it lets you really address risk and understand where to start. So another thing I commonly see is people think, okay, I patch a CVE, now a bad guy can't hack me. Well, generally speaking, when I take over an environment, I don't actually exploit a CVE, right? So I'm not actually exploiting this version is out of date, run an exploit. That's usually not how it goes. That was more common back in like 2000 timeframe, but nowadays, you kind of abuse application logic. So we're going to talk about some of those ways. One of the most common ways I abuse application logic, but that's generally how I identify a lot of risk on the outside, is just abusing features that are given to users on the outside, right? So a feature would be logging in, forgetting your username and recovering it, forgetting your password and recovering it. We're going to talk, those are all features and application logic that controls it that I will abuse to take over an account. So we'll kind of go on to the next slide here. Another thing I commonly see is, well, we have MFA, we're secure. And I've never been in an environment that has full MFA. I'll just say that. Everybody tells me they have full MFA on all their users. Haven't seen it yet. So it's a safe assumption to say that you probably don't, even if you think that. So it's important to understand that. But it's also not a silver bullet. It doesn't really solve the problem completely. So a question I often ask customers is just, if you needed to reset your password or reset your multi-factor authentication device, say you dropped your phone and it broke and you got a new phone. What's the process that a user would go through to get reestablished access? In a large environment, generally speaking, especially when if they support remote workers, they call into the help desk, and the help desk goes through a process to help that person reestablish access. Well, it's been my experience that that's done very poorly. So when I call the help desk, I'll say, "Ah, man, I broke my phone. I'll do reconnaissance on a user and open source intelligence gathering and build out a user profile. So I know their name, date of birth, and details that might get asked. And I call in, I'm pretending to be that user. And I just broke my phone. I can't get into my email. It was multi-factor was set up with my phone. I got a new one. I need some help." In this last hospital engagement, believe it or not, what they ended up doing was saying, "All right, we'll send you a QR code to your email." And I said, "Well, I can't get into my email." "Oh, huh. You have like a Gmail you could use?" I was like, "Oh, I do have it. Yeah, I've got a Gmail." So they sent me the QR code to my Gmail, and I registered my phone, set up a new password, and took over the account, all with a quick phone call, had a little bit of information about the user, and I quote unquote broke my phone. So you want to understand, how is that being taken place in your environment? This is a very big risk that's not going to show up in a vuln scanner. And it has to do with abusing that core business process, as well as maybe abusing some of the account aspects as well. So account management aspects, what I'll talk about in the next slide. So attacking the actual authentication. This is a really high success rate. I just talked about how we deal with the multi-factor part. Maybe that's not even involved. Maybe you don't have multi-factor, or it's just that first login, username and password. If you've ever had an email given to you that said, "Oh, we've recovered your username, here it is," but you didn't do that, someone's trying to break into your account. Why is that? The forgot username feature is how I do username enumeration. Because generally speaking, when you submit usernames to that, it'll tell you if you're right or wrong. It happens all the time. It'll say, "Oh, there's no username found in the database." Or on success, it'll say, "Sent an email. You have access to your email," which I don't have yet, but I now know your username. And if you look at hospitals, they're really good at telling you who works there. They're really good at telling you a directory of people that are there. And generally speaking, usernames are kind of guessable, right? First name dot last name, first initial dot last name. You can kind of put them together. They're often also part of the email address, right? So if it's just j.smith@yourhospital.com or whatever, then you can kind of extract it from there. So that's how you can validate usernames. Well, what about passwords? Well, there are a couple ways you can go about that. You can just do password guessing attacks, and you say, "Well, I got lockout." Well, do you? Because I will actually set up and compromise about 50 accounts per engagement, where I do what's called a slow brute force. I'll do one password attempt per hour for 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And I avoid the lockout, and I still get in thousands of password guesses. And I tailor my password guesses to local sports teams, things that are common, right? Commonly seen, keyboard walks, things like that. It works. It still always works. Another area is the forgot password feature. How is that being done? I've seen a lot of places move to a self-service password reset process where they have you answer secret questions. So you forgot your password. It'll say, "What's your username?" "Forgot my password." And it asks a bunch of questions to answer, like 2, 3, 4 questions to answer. I had one engagement in a hospital where it asked, what was your first car, and what's your favorite sports team? And it was 2 questions you had to answer. And they would rotate through a pool of questions, but I found out in the client side of the request, I could control what questions got asked. There's a parameter in there as we put based on a number, so you can actually control which questions you were going to try to answer, and then it would tell you which question you got right or wrong. So which car, Honda, which sports team, and it would tell you like, "Oh, this answer to the first question was wrong. The answer to the second question was wrong." Okay. Then I would basically focus. I went to, ChatGPT, give me a list of all cars in like the last 30 years. Gave me a big list, and I just tried them, and I eventually got a hit. Honda worked, Civic worked, right? Toyota worked. And then I would do the next one. And another question that wasn't a sports team was, what city were you born in? ChatGPT, give me a list of all the cities. Same thing. And because it told me which answer I got right, I could do one at a time. I didn't have to have the combination correct. And then it didn't penalize me for guessing. I could guess thousands of times per minute. So I basically just brute forced those secret questions and got into 5 different accounts. And then I said, and they said, oh, well, we got multi-factor, so we're not worried. Guess what? 2 of the 5 did not have multi-factor. Lo and behold, right? So again, this is abusing that application logic, that feature, and gaining access to accounts and breaking into the inside, right? Because those accounts actually had Citrix, virtual desktop. I was inside. And again, that's one of the things I see on every engagement is that, and that's that first one there, that account management component, how accounts are managed, right? How passwords are reset, how multi-factor devices are, reset. It's been my experience, there's not a great solution for that. And it falls back to often that human element or application logic, both of which can be attacked. There's also a lot of issues in Active Directory. I'm going to show you guys a slide on that. Understanding your external footprint, right? We talked about that, how, if you don't even know what's on the internet, those IoT devices could be on the internet, definitely bad. Network shares, always a problem, right? And again, the things I'm showing you here, I've never not seen on an engagement in the last 15 years, right? So this is, it's not like somebody had this fixed. No one's had it right? Physical security issues, I'll talk about that. Default credentials, usually 50 to 100 systems, when I go on a network, have default credentials or configurations, 50 to 100. I have yet to be on an engagement that doesn't. And then there's a lack of detections. We'll talk about that too. So default credentials are definitely a extra big problem for hospitals. And it's due to those medical devices, those non-standard technology components that don't tie into Active Directory. They're managed, the username and password are managed just on the device. Maybe you change the default administrator password, but there's other default accounts on it you didn't change, right? And you just didn't know because you're like, well, I didn't see that in documentation. So there's a lot of like little things there to unpack. And again, like I said, the average is 50 devices I get into. And when I get into them, we're talking PHI, PII, access to potentially life supporting technology, a lot of risk, a lot of risk. So what do? We will identify the systems on the network. Usually it's with a tailored in-map scan. You can use whatever, right? Like if you can even extract the host from your vulnerability scanner, that's fine. And we use another tool called Go Witness. Go Witness is a great tool for situational awareness on the network. It's open source. It essentially takes a screenshot of all of your landing pages for web applications and gives you a bird's eye view. So in a single report, you can scroll through and see like 100 to 1,000 different applications. So you can see all your applications and say, okay, this is a Dell iDRAC server, WordPress server. What's this thing over here? I'm not even sure. That's weird. Pull up in your browser. It's this, weird IoT device. Does it have default credentials? You can look that up, right? And that's how we go about it. And that's how I suggest folks that are managing security add that extra level of analysis on top of your vuln scanner to like actually look at all those web interfaces on the inside of your network, because there's a lot. And that's usually where the default credentials live, is on those, web applications for these medical devices. Maybe you don't even realize the web aspect is even turned on. Maybe you can turn it off, right? So there's a lot of ways to address it. And that's how I suggest. The next area that I see on every engagement is issues in Active Directory. Active Directory is a very difficult problem to solve. Over decades of use, right? This is what controls and manages Microsoft infrastructure on the network. Over decades of use, it becomes a sort of a rat's nest of permissions. And it's very complicated, and there's a lot of, specialized knowledge that goes into how to exploit it. But here are some common things that I see on every engagement. Certificate abuse. There's ways to abuse the PKI infrastructure in Microsoft to masquerade as anyone in the environment by using the certificates and templates and things of that nature that are on configured in Active Directory. There's also Kerberoasting. This is a Microsoft essentially baked-in feature that's never going to get fixed. It's based on service accounts that get published with what's called an SPN record on an Active Directory, and you can request a ticket granting ticket from the service account. And inside that is a password hash representation you can extract and try to crack offline. This is not getting fixed. This is how it is. So the proper defenses are making sure that you support higher levels of encryption with Kerberos for that attack, as well as making sure that those service accounts have strong passwords. And I recommend Microsoft Group Managed Service Account feature that automatically rotates the password, because what you find with service accounts are they were made 12 years ago. Somebody set a static password, hasn't changed since. Password never expires. I like that. I like that because it helps me crack the password easier. 12 years ago, password complexity was a lot less of a thing than it is today. And the way technology has improved, you can crack things a lot easier. So that's just something to be aware of. And again, you pretty much see it on every engagement and have seen it for the last decade. Excessive permissions, see that a lot. What you see here in the screenshot is a user, and to the right is all the things that user can do. That is a lot. It's so much you can't even see it. It just looks like white. Those are all lines, individual things that user has action over, can do various different permissions like generic all or whatever it might be. And this was a standard user in this environment. Their permissions can get baked in a lot of different ways. I've seen permissions get applied where the everyone group has generic all over the domain. Now, what does that mean? Well, everyone is inside the everyone group. That's not too shocking, right? But that's the case. Every user. And if you have generic all to the domain, you can do everything to everything, which means everyone was a domain admin effectively. And that permission had been there for 10 years and they didn't know about it. So if you got any account, you were complete control over the environment. It's kind of crazy. And that's been there for that long because, again, it's not something that shows up in a vuln scanner. But that permission, that's huge risk. It's one of the craziest risks I've seen personally. But that's the kind of stuff you pull out. There's other privilege escalations. It's not always that obvious. A lot of times it's chained together. This user can reset the password of this user, who then can reset the password of the service account, who then has generic all to domain admins, right? You chain them together. But the idea is, how can a standard user level escalate up to domain admin? Usually there's about 7 different ways. Weak passwords are still a problem. Even with multi-factor, once you're on the inside, you usually don't even need to have 2-factor. And users still use weak passwords. So again, that slow brute force technique is still a valid technique here. I also like to look at the accounts that have never been used. Those are often the ones that are set up with default passwords that you might be able to find on the share. How to set up a user account, log in from welcome123, and you can change the password after that. Those accounts that have never been used probably have that default password. And then this is a big one too. Risk and disabled accounts. You might think, I disabled the account, the risk is gone. That is seldom the case. When you disable an account, all you require I do is enable it to then use it and abuse it, right? So disabling an account, let's go back to the example where everybody was a domain admin, right? If you disable an account, well, the service account has a problem. I'm going to fix it, I'm going to remediate it by disabling it. Well, who can enable that account? You might find that Bob in finance can, because he's got some weird path up through another user. So I like to actually, when I take over environments, I like to do it through disabled accounts to make people's eyes open. Like, what? How did you do that? And you can almost see their whole worldview, sort of shift. That account was disabled. You couldn't abuse it. All I had to do was turn it on again, and I could abuse it. So you have to look at the inbound rights. Who can touch this account to establish, is disabling the account actually removing the risk? If somebody low level can touch it, it doesn't remove the risk, right? So that's why it's important to look at things in context a little deeper than just disabling it and it's fixed it. And if you want to learn more, I know that I covered a lot here in the slide. We've got blogs and videos on all this, the reference in the slide deck here. So you can take a look at those. A lot of, there's also videos. The videos are linked at the end that walk you through a little more about how to do this if you're interested. A lot of power there with Active Directory, a lot of risk. The next thing, this is a little easier to deal with, is network shares. Again, I've not been on a network yet where network shares have been clean. It's just kind of human nature. Generally speaking, people don't even have a good understanding of what a standard user has access to in shares. I've been in environments where any standard user, they're not mapped to it, right? So the standard users can't see the share, but can they read write to it if they go looking? Very commonly they can. So I've seen a lot of times where standard users can get to the IT share, which has got scripts and documents and things that expose risk. Passwords are stored places. Sensitive data, like pay data, PHI data, PII data, all over the place. And it's pretty important for hospitals to lock that down, but they don't, a lot of times, in my experience, they don't realize what they actually have out there. Because again, common theme, this isn't going to show up in your bone scanner. So how do you look at it? How do you address it? What we suggest, we actually use a tool called Snaffler. It's an open source tool, and it scans the network shares for sensitive data. And you can even define your own sort of rules for it to look at. So if there's a particular string associated with a password that you found exposed, you could look just for that string and see where all the other instances of it are on the network. So that's a really good tool. I recommend pointing it at a share by itself. If you don't give it a share, it will scan the whole domain. And I don't like doing that on hospital environments. I like to do targeted scans. So just if you're going to have it scan a network, point it at the actual server with the share. And it can give you a good context of what a standard user would find. And again, like I said, in any given hospital, I'm going to pull out passwords, PHI, PII, all sorts of stuff. So, and again, you could check it in your vulnerability management process with Snaffler. That's the free tool you can use. The physical layer. So the problem with the difficulty here is that you obviously as a hospital have to let the public in, right? So anytime you have to have the public in, it's a huge challenge. It's a lot different than maybe a business that can control who comes in and out, but the hospitals is an extra big challenge, right? So you guys have security guards, multiple levels usually. Usually the first level is pretty easy to get by. You come in and you say, make an excuse why you're there. Maybe you're just coming in as a patient. They let you in. And then you can't get to the sensitive areas, usually like you've got your NICU and stuff blocked off. You've got server room and stuff hopefully blocked off. In those public areas, you want to take a look at are there switch ports accessible and are they locked down? I've found oftentimes they're not locked down, and I can, in a public area, sit down by a chair, by like a pillar, plug into the wall. I'm on the internal network, and I can, circumvent all the external controls right from that. And it's pretty common for people to be hanging out in hospitals for a long period of time, so it doesn't look weird, right? So you can be there and cause a problem. The control there is that locking down those ports in public areas, and then there's obviously the situation of various different controls put in place that could be bypassed. Here's an example. This is a pretty fun one of me bypassing a locked door control with compressed air. So what this is that sensor is looking for a temperature change on the other side of the door. Your body generally creates that temperature change. It could be hot or cold. Obviously, when you walk in front of it, it detects the heat of your body, unlocks it so you can leave. In this instance, I'm spraying cold air through, and that's creating the temperature change, unlocking the door. This can also be done with a strong magnet. Some door locks are based on magnets. You can just put a big magnet up there and can also achieve the same effect of opening the door. Another really useful way at hospitals, you guys are busy. I'm just going to tailgate around. What I'm tailgating is essentially following somebody through a layer of access control. It works very often. I'll tell you a story that was very effective at one hospital. So one of the objectives was to show access to sensitive areas like the NICU. So what I did was I came in through the main entrance and got through that main security guard. The second security guard by the elevator that would take you up to the sensitive floor was on it. Could not get past that person. It was hold up. You don't have the badge. Hold up. Tailgating didn't work. I got hold up. Even if I said, I got to get up there. Doesn't matter. You don't have the badge. Go back to the first security guard. She was on it. That person was rock solid. Wasn't getting past her. So as I looked around the hospital, I realized on the floor 3, there was a heavy construction. So I would go up around the area to floor 3 using the elevator that was allowed, not the restricted elevator. And then through that construction, I would walk back through to the other side that was restricted, and then take the elevator up from there where there was no security guard at floor 3 to the top level where there was the NICU. There was a guard in front of the NICU. However, that guard was so used to the second layer guard being on it. She was just on her phone, And I would always wait towards the end of their shift. I would kind of like, because people would get tired at the end of their shift. They're ready to go. They're planning. Where am I eating? Where am I going with friends? She's on her phone, and I'm walking through, and she literally buzzed the door open for me without even looking up for her phone. And I walk in, right? So that third layer was just so trusting of the second layer that allowed me to bypass when I crossed over from the construction. So there's a lot of ways that you can get around these controls. You want to understand them and test for them. And obviously, that the fault there was construction, as well as that third level security guard kind of wasn't doing her job. So that's kind of the physical layers. A lot of those types of examples. Detection gaps. So what I commonly see when I do pen tests at hospitals, and it kind of applies to all environments too, is that places are focused on finding malware in the environment based on like outbound beacons or host-based indicators. So they get, their tools are baked into some threat intelligence where it says, hey, this domain is bad. If you see activity to this domain, you've got this level of this infection, this malware, and you call, reimage the device, put it back on the network. It's an over-reliance on that sort of hunting for beaconing activity from known malware. But on the inside, it's usually I can be as loud as I want. There's no problem. So a question I usually ask is, if somebody did a DC sync attack on your network right now, inside, would you detect it? I've only had one place detect it in my entire career. Odds are the answer is probably no. What is a DC sync attack? That is where it's a built-in protocol in Active Directory that allows for domain controller replication. So it's replicating the AD database between domain controllers. So if there's anybody that's not a domain controller replicating the database, that's a huge problem. That's like you wouldn't get many false positives from that. You can define in your rule, you can define your domain controllers and ignore those domain controllers. And if anybody that's not in the domain controllers list DC syncs, you got to raise every alarm bell because they just are getting the password hashes for every user. So that's a good example, right? That's not a malware beacon. That's an internal attack behavior. And that's why, generally speaking, most compromised networks, it takes about 204 days to detect that breach from a real threat actor. I'm not talking about like malware that's on the network. Yeah, you're going to find that stuff. I'm talking about a real threat actor targeting you. Usually it's about 204 days. That's at least an IBM statistic from a breach report. And I would say that kind of tracks. So, and the reason being is because there's a lack of controls. Once on the inside, they can you can kind of be loud. I usually don't have to worry too much about being stealthy in hospitals. And the motivation here is you want to make sure that you're looking for attacker behavior on the internal network and not just focusing on outbound beaconing activity from known malware. If you're doing that, you're missing, anyone that's really targeted for your environment. So that's where that purple team element that we do at the end comes into play. It's really, really valuable because we would do a DC sync attack or a myriad of others. And then we can tell you the timestamp and you can go back and we can work together, say, hey, Tuesday at 2 p.m. we did this and you got no logs for it. Okay, well, we got to figure out how are we going to alert for that. Let's talk about what are your tools in your environment for alerting, and let's figure out how we can tune them. And then we do it again, and you fire. You got an alert for it. Great. Now you've got some confidence. And again, the goal there is to build high confidence triggers. You do not want to overload your analysts with like a bunch of false positives. So that's where like you can really fine tune them during that process to get some high confidence triggers if somebody's on the network, those early warning indicators. And again, that's a risk that you usually see on every network. Okay, we're almost towards the end. Thanks for hanging with me, everybody. I know I've been talking a lot. Boy, you can't really do anything these days without talking about AI. I would feel remiss if I didn't bring it up here, right? So artificial intelligence is coming in a huge wave. So we're going to talk about sort of what does it mean? What can we do now to address it? Well, first off, it's being used in your environments right now, right? Everybody's using it. My mom's using ChatGPT, right? Everybody's using it. Everybody's using AI. How do we, do you have a governance policy about how AI is used in your environment? If you don't, that's the first good step. Are users allowed to use it? If so, how? The reason being is that non-technical users usually don't understand that when they put data into this AI, it's going to some remote server, and what are they doing with it? Well, we don't know. So you don't want to put PI, you don't want to put sensitive data in there. And you imagine a hospital's mission, folks using AI, it might slip in there, especially if they don't know any better. So that's where it's like good to have some educational documentation and policy around AI's usage in your environment. The other area is procurement. I'm sure if you're an IT person right now or working in security, try to buy a product right now that doesn't say it's got AI in it. You're gonna have a hard time doing that. Now, most of the time it's just marketing because everybody's trying to get on the AI bandwagon. But AI is being put into everything. So it's important for you to understand when you go through your procurements, how is it being used? Is it local? Is it going, where's it going? That's a really important thing because a lot of people are implementing AI breakneck speed, right? And security is always that afterthought. Because reality is what's driving AI is people want to make money. These vendors, right? They want to make money. They're not going to make sales if they're not talking about AI, advanced stuff, right? So they're putting it in, and how are they putting it in? That's the thing. So you want to make sure you understand that with your procurement process. Another thing is AI is just a feature. So say they put it in, it's a feature, right? We talked about feature abuse during your login. It's just another feature that I can abuse. So we have one example where, an AI is often starting with a prompt usually, right? You're leveraging some sort of prompt often. And we sent an image with an embedded commands inside, and the AI actually executed the commands, right? So it's again that it was implemented in an insecure way, had a good reason behind it, but it was that breakneck implementation that we're seeing from the industry, and security is that afterthought. The security doesn't necessarily make the money right now, but getting the AI and the tool does. So that's why it's important to understand how it's being leveraged and make sure that you're establishing some good tests around how you're implementing AI in your environment. Especially with hospitals, right? The sensitive data. So let's see here. We do have some blog posts as well on how you conduct some common attacks with AI. If you want to read up on it, on our blog there, it's linked. And these are the 5 key takeaways that we've built with HHS OIG. I think I mentioned we did work alongside them to conduct a myriad of hospital penetration tests. These are essentially the high-level takeaways that HHS officially put out. So it's enforcing that configuration management, right? We talked about that already with those default passwords. We still see it on every engagement. It's been around forever, as long as technology existed. I think back to the Hackers movie, the default password was in that, right? Still a problem today. And lock down those external authentication. Really, if you take something away from this, go back to your environment and ask yourself, what do I need to do to reset a password or get a new MFA device? And walk through that process. Is it secure? How is the password reset features? Is it fully automated? Is it asking questions like we talked about that could be brute forced? Is it involved calling the help desk? If so, when you call the help desk, what information do you need to know? Because it's been my experience, a name and confidence is all you need to know. A name and confidence. Surely, if you call and you sound all nervous, you're going to realize something's fishy. But if you're just like, hey, I got to get in, I'm locked out, I'm so and so, you can have some success. Adopt OWASP into your framework for both development as well as looking at vulnerabilities. That kind of goes back to that application logic issue that I was talking about. Don't just rely on network vulnerability scanners, right? So definitely look into web application vulnerability scanners as well as just logic, fall, and abuse, which usually you don't get from a vuln scanner. You usually get from a human interacting with it. Validate that human factor. We talked about that a few different ways. One being a guard. We've talked about the help desk example a few times. Obviously, there's the trivial example of phishing. I find a lot of places have a pretty good phishing setup. And then again, that last area here is those business flaw logics, like really looking at how those features are given to users of the technology. How can it be abused? Start thinking about vulnerabilities and risk, how to abuse features of technology, and will open the door outside of just those, hey, this thing's out of date. Because nowadays, everything I do taking over a network has nothing to do with the version being out of date. It has to do with me abusing configurations and business logic. So I think that is it. And I do believe we've typed some questions. And then, like I said, these slides will be available. There's a lot of links in there to learn more. So if you want to, you can further your reading after this call. And I also would say One of the areas that we talked about was the external attack surface. If anybody that's on this call is interested, we can give you a free external attack surface report. It doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't. We don't send any packets to your network. It's basically building your report that what does it look? What does a bad guy when they think of my environment? What do they see? We scan hundreds of different internet resources for things associated with you and give you a report to show you who's been in breach data, what's my external footprint, what's the tech stack that you see outside there, what IP addresses, what ASNs, what domains, do I have the proper configuration for email security on my domain? We give you that sort of like lay of the land so you kind of have an idea of what a threat actor sees. And we do that for free. So you can reach out if you're interested. With that, I'll take any questions.
Ooh, looks like I got a question here. All right. So we got a member asking, saying their hospital is owned by a corporate entity. So does their security of the owner actually impact the subsidiary?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I found a lot of hospitals do have sort of a corporate entity that rolls up maybe like a dozen hospitals or so, and they're managed under a corporate entity and they're connected. And it's important in those environments to a lot of the controls might be inherited from that corporate entity, and you also inherit all their risks as well. So I had an environment once where I tested the corporate entity, and because I compromised the corporate entity, I also had domain admin across all 12 hospitals. So it's important to understand your corporate entity's risk and work with them to discuss, what are they doing for penetration testing and risk analysis, because that all trickles down to the hospital layer as well. And that was a pretty big eye-opening moment because it was basically me starting to work with a hospital. We realized during the planning phase that all their controls were with the corporate entity. We're like, well, we should be testing the corporate entity, and they got the corporate entity involved. We tested both the hospital and the corporate entity, but it ended up showing risk to all the other 11 hospitals, right? The same flaws were for all of them. So it's pretty scary because as I compromised that one hospital, I actually could have put ransomware at every single one.
Wow, that is pretty scary. Looks like we got one more here. If you had three ways to improve security for a hospital, kind of what would be the first three things you would do?
Yeah. So many of this we talked about, but I would have a good understanding of your external footprint. Usually that's the first area that people are shocked by, but it's pretty important because if you don't know this already, when you're connected to the internet, part of the big boy internet, you are getting attacked and scanned 24/7, 365, round the clock, nonstop. So understanding what you have exposed there is critical. Also, Active Directory. It's just the area that has so much risk. And if you've never had a deep dive in your Active Directory, it's definitely worth it. You'll unearth a tremendous amount of risk that you didn't know about. And then I would say that account management aspect, right, which kind of builds on the external, but really looking into how are your accounts managed, how are passwords reset. That's super critical. That's how I'm successful in almost every engagement. And if you look back, there's been some pretty big ones recently, like the MGM hack was the same hack that I'm talking about, right? Just that cost millions and millions of dollars. So just making sure you've got those. I would start with those three.
Perfect. We're running a bit low on time, but I think we have time for a few more. Looks like we got one here. AI is a hot topic these days. How do you account for AI in healthcare security?
Yeah, it is a hot topic these days. We talked a lot about that already, so I'll just kind of reiterate understanding where AI is in your environment as you do procurements. I think that's going to be a huge thing going forward as you're going through new procurements. Anything you procure now is going to have AI in it pretty much. And you want to understand how they're implementing it. And is it local to the device? Where is it going? It might actually shift what you procure because of that, right? So, you definitely want to know that. And then also having a governance policy around AI's acceptable use in your environment. I haven't seen anybody do that yet. And, it's pretty important because you have to assume your users are going to use it. Everybody's going to. So they have to understand what your hospital's official policy is on it and then how they can use it safely if they're allowed to at all.
Awesome. Can you point to one tool to detect and crawl web apps?
Yeah,
you got one do it all.
Yeah, my do it all tool is Burp Suite Professional. It's like $400. It's worth paying for. The free version, community edition's throttled. pretty slow. You're not going to want that. $400, pretty cheap license. And when I do web application hacking, that's the only tool I really need. It's sort of a Swiss Army knife. It allows you to do spidering, crawling, all that good stuff. And what's also really important with web applications is unlinked content enumeration. That is where you see most of your risk. I didn't talk about that, but that's stuff that's not tied in the actual links in the code, but it's finding stuff that's unlinked. Burp does have a discovery content feature that's good. There's also tools like GoBuster and things of that nature that are free tools that are just for that purpose. But Burp Suite is your bread and butter pen test web application tool. You don't really need anything else. It's got everything baked in, and it has a bunch of different community supported apps that you can install to increase its functionality as well. That's definitely the go-to tool.
Awesome, awesome. And then, so you were talking about medical devices earlier on the presentation. We have a member asking, how do you manage the engagement of a security program where there is passive monitoring, but clients don't want much to be done on the medical devices?
Yeah, so at the engagement level, if they don't want anything done, then we would have to do that white glove walkthrough where we're sitting down with the admin and we're having them kind of discuss like, okay, let's see, it's updated. Let's see what accounts are on this system, and you kind of go through it more as like a security check. I don't know if that was the frame of the question, or if it was how do you monitor and secure them more. Um, if it's monitoring question, it's a difficult one. The way that I would handle it is I would first have identification of what those devices are, and I would have different rules set up for traffic to those devices. So that if you see, for example, all of a sudden you see web traffic to that device, but you don't normally see that, that might be reason to flag an alert and investigate a little bit. Because if you know the web application is never used, that might be a good way to go about it, is addressing some monitoring focused in on first identifying what IP addresses are there, and associating them differently than your normal enterprise assets in your monitoring solution.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more. The Hospital of Things exposes you to vendor vulnerabilities. How do you compensate your risk profile to accommodate an entity you have no control over? Can you even do it realistically?
Yeah, if you're talking about the myriad of risk you get from all the different technologies you put in there, it is difficult. You're going to have risk that you can't fix, right? You talk about like, hey, there's a vulnerability in this technology, and we do see it, right? You see like old technology that's got to run on Windows XP, for example. See that on hospitals. So what do? You got to have XP on the network. It's got to be that super old, maybe have an SMB vulnerability just in the OS, and it's got to be there for this technology. Well, in that event, I would use probably network level controls to segment the network out more and put that on a sensitive part of the network, right, that you can't reach from other areas that aren't necessary, right? So if you're on the standard user area of the network, you couldn't just go touch it. You have to be on that actual network segmentation. So I think I would use like layer 3 controls to sort of like segment the network away from some of those areas. But it's a difficult one, and I don't think it'd be an easy problem to solve completely.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, unfortunately, I think we are at time, but from Health-ISAC, I really want to thank Breakpoint Labs for coming out and being a navigator and doing this webinar. I think my favorite part was the compressed air on the other side of the door, but without navigators like Breakpoint, we wouldn't be able to do what we do here at Health-ISAC at scale. So just thanks again to Breakpoint for coming out and supporting the community. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.